If you've ever tried to read a comprehensive evaluation and thought, great, now I need a math degree in order to figure this out, this episode is for you. Because today we're breaking down norm reference tests. I'll answer the questions, what are norm reference tests? In plain English so that everyone can understand it. Basically, without the statistics, right? By the end of this episode, you'll know what the numbers are trying to tell you and what they matter most. So grab a notepad or your favorite drink and let's get started. Well, hello everyone. My name is Tracy Young, OG tutor extraordinaire, founder of theliteracykeys.com, and most importantly, mom of a dyslexic daughter. Welcome to my podcast, where you'll discover ways to unlock your child's reading potential. I'll share tips, strategies, and war stories that have happened along the way, because everyone deserves to be able to read. So let's get started. Are you reading another email from the school, wondering whether you're overreacting or maybe underreacting? I'm Tracy Young, and you're listening to the Literacy Keys podcast. I'm an Orton Gillingham trained tutor, right? ALTA certified. And I tutor struggling readers and dyslexic kids, mostly in middle school and high school. It's part of the onboarding. A lot of times I frequently receive comprehensive evaluations and have to interpret them. I've got to look at all of the numbers and see the patterns that are emerging. Why is this important? Because it allows me to individualize my tutoring sessions based on the profiles of strengths and weaknesses for the individual child. Now, in the last couple of episodes, I talked a lot about the different types of testing, whether that was for twice exceptional kids, right, kids with ADHD, or any other conditions such as dyslexia. And basically, it was kind of the ABCs, right, or basically a soup of all these different acronyms for the names of all these tests. And as I was going through and talking about the different tests, I kind of realized that these reports make perfectly smart parents feel completely inadequate. It's as if you need a translator just to interpret or decipher what they're trying to tell you. And let's be honest, your child scored in the 23rd percentile is not necessarily the comforting bedtime story that you want to hear. But I'll let you in on a little secret. My own daughter scored in the bottom 2 percentile, right, on one of these norm reference tests, or it was a subtest. And I remember that gut punch. So in this episode, I'm going to answer, what are norm reference tests in plain English? I'm going to walk you through what the tests can and cannot tell you, right? And why you could end up with wildly different results, right, for the same kid or the same two kids taking the same test. Now, the information might be nice, but most importantly, I'm going to explain what you can do with this information, right? All right, no wisecracks, please, right? I don't want you to be left holding a piece of paper with a bunch of numbers and you're like, great, now what do I do? I really don't understand this, and I'm not going to get a degree, a PhD in statistics. All right, so let's start with the big picture. Why norm reference tests exist? All right, my favorite word, and everyone that knows me, why? I need to understand what is going on behind the situations. So with norm reference tests, schools and clinicians need a way to compare one student's performance to a much wider audience of individuals. And that's what norm reference tests are designed to do. Again, the name is not exactly user-friendly, but norm reference refers to a bell-shaped curve, right, where we plot all the results. The middle of that curve represents the average. And then you have one side, which is the performance above average, and you have another side with the performance below average. So they compare one child's score to the rest of the kids. Now, the best way to think about this and why it's so important, let's say your 13-year-old takes the test. Basically, your child's performance is being compared to other 13-year-olds who took the same test. And this is really important, right? That comparison group is what is called the norm group, right? Again, fancy names, just jot it down. It'll all begin to make sense. The score tells you where your child's performance falls relative to the rest of the kids in the group. Now, this is different from another type of test, which is called criterion reference tests. And criterion reference tests evaluates specific information, perhaps a specific skill, right? How you know whatever, how you know the information on the American Revolution and so forth. That's criteria-based tests. And that's not what we are talking about. Right? So just in case you are ever on Jeopardy, and it's what is the difference between norm reference test and a criterion reference test, you can now answer it. All right, but I digressed. So let's get back to what we were talking about. Let me give you a kitchen table definition. Norm reference tests are standardized measures that compare your child to a larger group of kids who are the same age. That's it. All right. These tests are popular because they give us a common language. So if I tell you the standard score is 100, right, that represents the average score. 85 is below average, and 115 is above average. So you can begin to map out a pattern, again, all without needing a PhD in statistics. And if you're thinking, okay, yeah, I'm beginning to understand it, but I feel like I still need a translator, that's okay. That's normal. Keep listening. It will begin to make more sense. The scores that show up in the reports, when an evaluator is assessing a condition, they're usually looking for a specific profile. And norm reference tests help demonstrate that a child's results are significantly below what is expected for their age. I already talked about the different tests in a previous episode, and I will link that episode in the show notes. So if you want to understand what a CTOP is, a WISC, a Wyatt, and everything else, then that episode is for you. But now this episode is really, how do I interpret this? What do I take away from what the scores on these tests show me? All right, so there's some vocabulary that you need to know. Most of the norm reference tests report a couple of things. They'll report a percentile rank, and that means the percentage of same age peers your child scored at or below. Another is a standard score. So you have percentile rank, right, which is percentage, and then you have standard scores. Now, the standard scores are usually out of 100 represents the middle, the average. A score below 100 is below the average. A score above is above the average. Some of the subtests that you will see, these are the smaller, more specific tests that you'll see on these reports, are scaled scores. And they report using a scale of 10 to 15 or 16, right? So you have numbers that you're going to see based on 100, with 100 being average. And then you're going to see underneath it some of the subtests, and there are going to be scaled scores on 10 representing average. Another vocabulary word that you'll hear is the confidence interval. And that basically is a range that acknowledges that these scores are estimates. So if your child were to take it again, you might not score in the exact same number, right? But it gives you a range within a certain amount of confidence. Again, less important. And then the other thing that sometimes you'll see on these reports will be age or grade equivalents. And really, it's often misunderstood. We'll explain it. Don't worry about it. Percentiles. Parents will latch on to the percentile ranking because, for example, if your report says that the 25th percentile, right? So your child scored in the 25th percentile, it does not mean that they got 25% of the questions answered correctly. And this is really important, okay? That's not what is being measured. What that means to say your child scored in the 25th percentile is that they performed better than 25% of the kids in the entire group who took the test. And that's why norm reference tests are so important. All right. A different way of looking at that is they scored below 75% of all kids taking the test of that same age. So let's dig into it a little bit. Percentile is a relative rank or position. So a 70th percentile means a position in which 70% of the values are below. 50th percentile is right in that middle. 25th percentile is below average, but not severely below average. 16th percentile, and that represents about one standard deviation from the mean, from that average of 100, that is where it begins to be considered below average. If you see a score in the 9th percentile, well, that begins to be significantly below average. And that's where you start to see those red flags or more concerns. Now, I recognize that seeing a low percentage can honestly feel like a gut punch, right? Again, my daughter scored in the 2 percentile, right? So 98% of all kids were scoring better than she was, right? What's important to understand is think of this as a snapshot of a skill on a particular day under particular circumstances. And that brings us to the next concept, standard deviation. Now, standard deviation measures the range of the data. Are they very clustered together, so the bell-shaped curve is nice and tight, or are they spread out over a wider area? Standard deviation tells us where the results fall, and it allows us to kind of equivalize different tests. So, for example, one standard deviation below or above captures 68% of all of the results. So, you plot out all the results onto a graph, you put the middle, that average, and then you go out. You go above and you go below. All right, so one standard deviation captures 68% of all of the results. Now, if I go out two standard deviations, then that captures 95% of all the people. Right? And why is this important? Because we want to see how they compare to what is expected or what other kids of the same age can perform. And that's why norm reference tests are so important. Basically, by looking at the standard deviation, it allows us to make different comparisons. Now, let's talk a little bit about some different score types. A lot of reports, you're going to see standard scores and you're going to see scaled scores. Now, standard scores are designed so that 100 is the average. 50%, so that's that middle, 50% of the kids are above and 50% of the kids are below. Now, many clinicians look at 85 as the lower edge of that average rank and 115 as the edge of above average, the higher rank. You can still have scores that fall outside of that, and that's fine. Standard scores, your mean, your average is 100. Your standard deviation is 15. So one score, so basically 85 to 115 captures 68% of all the kids. Score of 70 to 130, I should use two fingers because it's two standard deviations, captures between 95% of all individuals. Good so far? Now, why do we care? Because you're comparing your child to other children in the same group who took the test. And this gives us perspective. All right, now let's talk about some of the subtests, because the subtests, of course, are on a different scale, right? We can't make these things easy for that. So scaled scores measure more specific skills, and they're reported on a different scale. The average, the mean, that 50% is 10. Your standard deviation is 3. So a score between 7 and 13 captures 68% of all of the kids. Similarly, a score between 4 and 16, which represents 2 standard deviations from that middle, captures 95% of all the individuals. Good so far? Okay. The standard score tells us how the child did over a broad range, and the scaled score is how they did on some of the specific narrower subtests. The confidence interval, right? So now that your child took, let's say, this test on a specific day under specific conditions, right? A good test admits that there's some amount of uncertainty, right? And it's our confidence in saying, if we had tested your child multiple times, right, then their scores would fall in that range. Because kids can get distracted, a bunch of things going on, and everything else. Now, let me talk about another thing, grade equivalence, right? And sometimes this is really misunderstood. Why? Because it's weird, let's face it. Grade equivalent, let's say your child is 4.2. Well, what does that mean? He's fourth grade, but 0.2. It's the 0.2 that kind of throws you off. Now, it doesn't mean that your child can do fourth grade work in all reading contexts. It simply means that their score matched the average score of students in that grade on that specific test. So basically, it's really easy to kind of misinterpret. Now, as you read the reports, it is completely appropriate to ask questions about a score. Don't worry that this is going to make you sound like you don't understand. You are not a statistician, all right? You're also not a neuropsych. You're a parent. You're a parent trying to help your child and to understand where and why your child is struggling. Right? Now, a good evaluator is going to slow down and they are going to make sure you understand what they're saying. Ask if you can record it if you need to and you can play it back. Right? I'm sure you're going to have questions afterwards for that. There's just so much information that's being thrown at you. So hopefully These explanations help you understand the information, what is being presented, and what the results are telling you. Now, there's another thing that really can come into play and is very important. You, as the parent, see a lot of things that a test or an evaluation isn't necessarily going to pick up. So it's really important that you document a skill that seems to be below expectations. All right. That's what these tests are doing. And they corroborate. I got to look it up. All right. The profile or the patterns of strengths and weaknesses that are behind the struggle. You're looking to rule out. It's not related to intelligence. There's some other factor. Now, let me flip it around because there are some limitations for these types of tests. Right? A norm reference test does not automatically mean that your child's going to get a diagnosis. A simple low score in one of the tests, right, doesn't tell you everything you need to know. And just as importantly, an average score may be masking weaknesses and compensation that your child is doing that they've already figured out, right? So that's why you've got to look at everything all together. Sometimes a child can score in the low average range, and often, maybe not every school, but too many, unfortunately. And the school says, oh, we're not concerned. Yep, they'll eventually get it. All right. Technically, the score might not be low enough, but honestly still represent a real, honest to goodness problem that deserves support. And that's where the documentation that I was just talking about that you can provide helps create a more holistic representation of the struggles that your child is experiencing. So, for example, homework takes 3 hours, it should take 30 minutes. Reading is exhausting, your kid needs to take a nap, right? Your child will avoid reading anything with print on it. Those are some of the things that may not be captured in a test over a short period of time that you can bring to the table, right? Either whether you are talking to the evaluator and say, this is what I am seeing. Let's dig in to understand what is happening. Which you basically, norm reference testing helps you move from, I know something is off, to here are the specific skills that need to be supported. Scores don't automatically translate into an action plan. Someone has to interpret them. So there are 3 questions that I want you to ask yourself when you get the report back. I want you to remember this episode, all right? Because they turn the report from data into a plan. And that's really what it's all about. So, the first question: what is the pattern across the scores? And this is something you can ask the evaluator, right? What is the pattern? It's like putting together the pieces of the puzzle. What are they consistently weak in? Ask the evaluator to point to the clusters, right? What are the weaknesses? For example, in dyslexia, decoding and spelling. Do both of those stand out as pain points? For a child with ADHD, do the ratings show consistent concerns with inhibition, working memory, organization? It's the pattern of weakness. The second question you want to ask: does this match what I am seeing in real life? Scores need to connect to function. If your child's processing speed is lower than average, then what does that look like at school? Maybe it's slow written output. Maybe it's trouble finishing tests. Maybe it's falling behind when they're trying to take notes. If rapid naming is low, does your child read accurately but slowly? All right, so that's the second question. Now, the third question, and this is the important one: What are the next steps? And you want to be thinking intervention and supports. So the reports need to answer, what do I do tomorrow? If this was a report on dyslexia, what type of structured literacy can be implemented? How often? With what intensity? Right? Those are all the questions. If it relates to ADHD, what are the supports that are needed at school? What behavioral strategies are needed at home? So if the report says average, but your child is drowning, right? That's of concern and it has an impact. So sometimes the best next step is targeted intervention or accommodations, even without this neat label. Because at the end of the day, you want to help your child. So remember, norm reference tests can feel intimidating, but they're just tools. And when we understand what they're measuring and we take that information and we pair it with the right instruction and the right support, kids change and their abilities take off. Their confidence soars, home life changes. They start saying, ooh, let me do that. Let me try. So remember, if you're staring at an evaluation report and you want help translating it to next steps, reach out and contact me through the literacy keys. And if today's episode gave you a little clarity, please share it with another parent who's in the thick of it. It's only by sharing this information that it helps all of us. Because when we're all doing better, right, then we don't do it alone. Now, before I sign off, I do want to mention, hard to believe it's snowing here, that summer is actually fast approaching. And I'm going to be offering a 6-week spelling challenge to help students become better spellers. I do have a few spots, and if that's something that you think your child can benefit from, reach out to us through our website, The Literacy Keys. So that's all I have for now. So, adieu until next week. Bye-bye. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to the Literacy Keys podcast. Follow us on social media, and most importantly, tell a friend. See you next week.